I'd now like to welcome all our panellists, all our speakers from the first session back up onto the panel for a discussion and questions. And if Stephen and Jackie, if you're welcome to join, we're going to get some more chairs because there's some questions for you as well. Yeah. Okay, great. Just a reminder, you're welcome to continue with questions as well as the questions on the Slido. There's also going to be some roving microphones, so people feel free if something comes to them to add. I'm actually going to start with a question for Jackie and Stephen. Certainly your presentation, Stephen, was very powerful, and I think a lot for many of us to reflect on. What are your thoughts about us being able to include, or the importance of us including patient experience measures within the data sets that we're collecting, ensuring that the patient remains the central focus of everything that we do?
Yeah, thank you. Look, as was indicated at the start of my presentation, there is such an increasing trend now to take into account the consumer or the patient, however you'd like to describe them. And this is such an increasing trend, and I'm sure you're coming across it. So I think it's essential that the thoughts and the feelings and the experience of the patient, the immediate family, and if it's a carer involved, but anyone directly associated with the patient, I think that it's really essential that that be taken into account, because every person is different, and their experience and the success of the operation, I think, surely must be aided by taking into account their personal situation. This idea of person-centred care, it's a growing trend. It's a valuable trend, and I think it's something that needs to be taken into account more and more.
Jackie?
Can people hear me? Yeah. It's a really timely question to be asked, and we will answer that better this afternoon. Elizabeth Armstrong and James Wright will answer that much better this afternoon. But the work we're doing around My Hip, My Voice is doing exactly that. And the work that we're doing with My Hip, My Voice is been driven by the Commonwealth Government. So the Commonwealth Government have a national strategy for clinical quality registries, and they absolutely recognise the importance of the consumer voice, and how we go about measuring the consumer voice is yet to be determined. James, I hope, will be able to present some of that information this afternoon, but we are starting to look at PREMs. It's not for us to determine what those patient-reported experience measures are. We actually want consumers to tell us what is important to them, so the information should come from them, not the other way around. But we've already started collecting data in the last week or so, so I think Fiona Stanley Hospital has got some PREM data already entered, which is an enormous step forward. The other piece of work we're doing is in relation to the registry data. People can access the registry reports now, they can access the data, but we do not present it in a way that is friendly to consumers, that is easily digestible and that has much meaning. It's very clinically driven. We've been doing work with consumers, asking consumers how they would like to see the registry data presented in a format that is meaningful to them. So again, Stuart Fleming, who's our webmaster, is doing some work with Elizabeth and James, both around the My Hip, My Voice work. So you'll hear more about that this afternoon, but it is absolutely on our agenda. We are cognizant that most of what we do is clinically driven, and at the end of the day, if we can't provide high quality, safe, effective, patient-centred care, we're failing in our job.
Thanks, Jackie. Christina, on that patient experience, you presented very well the challenges of ensuring there is a common data set that's important for wherever we are in the world. And you and Matt as well demonstrated that there was difference in, some of the patient experience reports, I think, whilst maybe differing subtly in what their issue might be, for example, having to pay or go on a bus, ultimately that the importance of having their voice heard is necessary. So how would you see it being able to fit into a global space, a patient experience measure? Christina and Matt.
Well, I must admit, do you hear me? Yeah. The current version 2 minimum common data set does not include patient-reported outcome measures, and this is a flaw. First of all, because it is very complicated for initiating audits that are just starting out in low middle income countries to include this. So we want to keep it as simple as possible in the basic common data set. For the advanced common data set, it would also be important and interesting, and we think this is something that should be established in more audits, but up until now there are very few that actually collect patient-reported outcome measures. I think it's the UK right now. Do they collect it? Germany, and I think that's it. There are just like 2 or 3 countries that do it right now of 10 established audits worldwide. So, and they do it with different scales. I think EQFD is the most common one, but there are different, and that's also something that should be discussed, whether the EQFD is relevant for this patient group, and whether it can also detect clinically relevant and for the patient relevant changes in this group.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great, that's heavy. Thanks, Catherine. So yeah, I guess patient experience, I couldn't agree more. Really, really important, obviously, but asking the right questions at the right time, using the right experience tools is really important, and no minor undertaking to work out what are the correct tools. In terms of applicability around the world, Catherine, I think really difficult, as Chris said, to start with that, and collecting patient-reported outcome or experience or both is hugely complicated. So general advice don't start with that, but once you've got an established audit, adding those into your audit, or at least in some limited way, I think hugely valuable for the future.
Thank you. Chris, yes.
Just add, even though we don't actually collect it in the minimum common data set, there are many variables, and also when we get them in published, the indicators that we suggest that are indirectly related with patient-reported outcome measures. For the patient, it's relevant to be operated early, to be out of bed early, to return back home. So those are things that we propose to be measured and that I think are relevant for patients, and also have been proven to be relevant for patients in your white trial, I think.
Chris, another question for you, and this is from Slido, and it relates to now that there's been the publication of the minimal data set, how do you recommend practically, or what are some of the challenges you see for groups that have been recording information in a different way or measuring something different? So it's almost the same but not quite, and I know that's something that we're looking at here in Australia and New Zealand. What's your recommendations for those challenges?
I think this is something Xavier will talk on later better in the Eden collaboration. It's looking for a common language. We're not actually asking anybody to change their data set. It's just that, for example, the level of mobility or the cognitive function, it's measured differently in different regions because maybe the scales haven't been validated in other regions, or you already use a clinical scale, but you do have to find a common language that can easily be translated into at least some of the subcategories so that you can agree and compare yourself with other data. But we aren't also trying to find that everybody collects the same data. We aren't trying to get a single square structure and everybody's supposed to fit in. It's just that we want to help other people get started, and we also want to help other people be able to compare between regions.
We've got lots of questions around the bisphosphonates and the audit in that space. I'd like to just start with a general question that's come up through a few of the Slidos. How do we determine who is best to prescribe? I mean, there's a lot of work in the space of ensuring people are safe to take bisphosphonates. There's a lot of discussion around people having oral examination or review before taking bisphosphonates. Is this something that should be embedded within the acute care space? And if that's only partially the case, how do we ensure better communication out to general practice and primary care? So I might start with Rebecca and Roger and then open up to the panel.
I'm going to throw that one to Roger because while I'm an associate professor, I'm not a medical doctor, or as my nan used to say, she's a doctor but she can't fix a broken bone.
Roger.
Yeah, it's a good question without a particularly good answer, I think. I think it's, I think care in Australia is much more fragmented than in New Zealand. In New Zealand, you're in the same health organisation. When you come in with your acute hip fracture, get it repaired, and you go to rehab, it's still part of that same organisation. So one would expect that before you leave that organisation, if you're having rehab, you should have your bone health assessed. It's one of the standards. So I would expect, seeing some people can get in the 50 to 70% range, that we should be able to set a standard that we should get that higher. Having said that, I think it's one of those problems for GPs that, they've got just a few patients that have got this problem, and how we can give them feedback and remind them, a bit like what I was saying before, we need to have a bit more real-time feedback to clinicians in the hospital about how they're doing. And I'm not sure how we can do that with GPs apart from better communication from secondary care when hip fracture patients leave. Kasim Javed from the UK was telling me that for fragility fractures, I know hip fracture's one, but for wrists and other things like that, if the GPs get onto it and the care gets embedded with them, then they get very good adherence. So clearly getting to primary care is an important step. I'm not sure what the best way of achieving that is, though.
Jackie?
So a hip fracture patient sitting in one of our hospital beds is an opportunity to prevent future fractures. What we are, and we can have all sorts of conversations about whether they all need dental checks or not. I don't personally believe they all need dental checks. I think we can ask about oral health. We can ask about whether they have got any planned dental interventions, etc. What we're not good in health doing is measuring the impact of not doing something. So we're worried that, the 1 in 10,000 that will get an atypical fracture 5 years down the track, or gets osteonecrosis of the jaw because they're having root canal work done. We're good at finding those cases. What we're not good at is actually quantifying how many patients we have failed to offer treatment to and therefore have gone on and subsequently fractured. So we cause harm by omission, and we're not good at measuring it. I would argue with the weight-bearing conversation, it is the exact same. You do harm by restricting people's weight-bearing. It has significant impacts in terms of complications, but it also has impacts on things that we don't measure, like functional status. If you put somebody essentially to bed for 6 weeks, you have a huge amount of muscle loss and loss of function, and that can be the difference between getting somebody home again and being independent and ending up in residential aged care because we're worried about a bit of metal. So I think we're not good at measuring harm from omitting to do things. I think we've got to get better at it. The evidence for secondary fracture prevention has been around for decades, and in this country only 30% of patients leave hospital on treatment. that is not acceptable.
Roger's got another comment.
This afternoon I'm talking about the Fragility Fracture Registry and the FLSs that are being developed in New Zealand. So this is a nationwide, fully funded strategy from the Accident Compensation Corporation, who are responsible in New Zealand for funding injury prevention, treatment and rehabilitation. So I'll talk about that. But that's hopefully going to make a difference in New Zealand in terms of prodding people to do it while they're in acute care. And one of the standards is that they have to provide a long-term care for the GP, a long-term care plan. So in other words, a plan of care to the GP. So hopefully that's going to help.
One of the other points during the Sprint audit presentation that was very interesting to me was the difference between New Zealand and Australia with respect to testing vitamin D levels versus just everyone getting it. I mean, we're in a phase of real sustainability pressure within the health system, and those tests are not inexpensive when balanced out. I mean, should we in Australia, and this is a question to the Australian physicians, geriatricians and clinicians, just be giving everyone vitamin D, and you know, what's the negative to that versus paying for the test? Who'd like to take that one?
I mean,
Roger.
the fun thing to me was that if Australia adopted that process, from those numbers, your prescription rate would increase 13%. Just like that, you'd be beating New Zealand. How good would that be?
That never happens, we don't know.
Yeah, we need to get our act together. I mean, that's stark data. We faff around with vitamin D levels in Australia. We all, and the health system, as Roger says, in Australia is much more fragmented, but even between hospitals, you know, in New South Wales, even between hospitals, the access to the different forms of vitamin D is different. I can't access the 50,000 international unit tablet that I would like to be able to use at the Prince of Wales. Meanwhile, down the road at Concord, they use it all the time. So we are negotiating with the statewide formulary committee to get the 50,000 international unit tablet available across the whole state. Other states of Australia have it available as well. I think I personally will stop doing vitamin D levels when I've got access to that tablet. There's lots of prompts there. It costs, I think an assay is about $15 to $20. So every time we do the vitamin D assay, it costs money, whereas vitamin D is as cheap as chips.
Matt, you presented some great slides on the importance of visibility of data. I know in the UK, when we look, the ability to have public-facing hospital facility-level data, I imagine at the beginning was quite confronting to clinicians. In Australia now, our hip fracture registry, well, it always has been identifiable. When we first started mortality, we kept it de-identifiable for 1 year and then everyone's identified. But can you speak to us about the challenges or how you engage then clinicians around the need or the importance of and benefits of people being able to see facility level data?
So probably Anthony Hansen, the team, are probably better placed to talk about this than me. I mean, it's uncomfortable, there's no doubt about it. And the first time you see your name either in highlights, you're delighted, but much more commonly, that tap on the shoulder, I think what the people have mentioned, is not a pleasant place to be. We had it years ago in my hospital. We were an outlier, and I'd say it was the best thing that ever happened to us, because the chief executive got a copy of that letter at the hospital, and he wasn't very happy at all. And suddenly all the resources that we felt we needed for the last 10 years suddenly became available to us to change the system. So actually bad news can be really helpful. So on the back of that sort of anecdote, I'm a huge fan, and it's got to the point now where the clinicians just accept this, and actually they've got over that fear of being an outlier. And even though it is very uncomfortable when you're there, it's an opportunity as well to improve things. So I think we've got there now, but definitely an uncomfortable journey, Catherine. Yeah.
It's interesting, it links into some of the getting it right the first time work that Seth mentioned as well. And I guess continuing on the data, but the outcomes incentives is very interesting. And, you know, in Australia, again, our system is very complex and it's different between state as well as federally. But we get penalised if you don't make a target, but in fact, not many systems, or certainly not in Queensland, are we set up to actually be paid more based on good performance. So you identify that as a significant change in outcome as well?
So yeah, absolutely. It took a long time to get enough data to actually show that, but yeah, that difference in difference analysis is quite compelling, that actually financial incentives do work if you target the right quality standards. But just to put that in perspective, the change in actual outcomes for patients is driven, or was driven to a much greater extent by the collection of data and the feedback. So worry about the financial incentives second, get the data and feed it back first, I think is the message for the whole world, really. Good quality data and feeding that back is much more important than the finances, certainly from my experience and a perspective from the UK.
Mm-hmm. Jackie?
It's worth saying we have tried to work with the Commonwealth in terms of incentivising care. So we've certainly met with the Independent Hospital Pricing Agency on more than one occasion. The previous government, there was some affection towards the idea of rewarding high quality care, and then a health minister changed, and literally within 2 weeks we were introducing penalties rather than incentivising care. At the end of the day, it is the same pot of money, and it's just how you package that pot of money. So if you want to incentivise, all you do is you reward for meeting the quality standards, just as they do in the UK, but you reduce the base tariff that everybody gets for providing an episode of care. So there are ways round it where you package it and sell it as rewarding quality, but the bucket of money that exists for health doesn't change. It's the way that we package things, and actually to penalise health practitioners who get out of bed every day to try and do a good job is not the way to incentivise good quality care. So I feel quite strongly that we should revisit the idea of incentivising care. Whether we get anywhere or not, I don't know.
Matt?
So I really totally agree with Jackie. Without going into too much detail, I know this has been recorded, so I get myself in trouble. This is a bit of a game, really. The pot of money is the same. It's just how you divvy it up. But what having a financial incentive does allow you to do is to make business cases at a local level. So if you realise that you're losing money compared to your colleagues, friends, competitors, depending on what system you work in down the road, and you need to get a new business case together for an orthogeriatrician, if you're losing this much money, then that to the local finance managers is palpable and real. So you're losing £500,000 a year because you're not hitting these incentives. What could I do with that money? Well, I could get more physios, specialist nurses and orthogeriatricians. So it's a game, I totally agree with Jackie, but it can be a useful game to play. But I would reiterate the point, good quality data is so much more important than the financial incentives, I think, certainly from the UK side.
Yeah, thanks. Seth, to you, and before we get on to the specifics of weight bearing, I think one thing that you spoke about that was a common discussion with the other presentations is the importance of being able to communicate and disseminate information to the staff within your hospitals and beyond. So I'd like to know how you then went about ensuring that the registrars, for example, were not just automatically writing partial weight bearing because that's how they've always done it for cannulated screws. So not so much about the really highly complex unstable fracture, but the routine use of full weight bearing. How do you recommend sites go about, changing practice for something like that?
I think you just have to be like a parrot and just repeat yourself over and over and over again. I'm in a funny situation. I'm a junior consultant, so I'm certainly not going to change the opinions of those above me in terms of orthopaedic consultants, but the registrars are certainly the future and the opportunity to change. We have trauma audit meetings twice a week. In every patient I see, I just say, is that full weight bearing? And I think the message will eventually get there. In terms of repeating the audit from those previous years, I think the hip fracture registry does that, and whether we change, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it's just about harping on the message repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Specifically then for the weight bearing, I think it's a really good point about the unstable fracture, or potentially one you're a little bit concerned about. How do you, as an orthopaedic surgeon, I'll open to the other orthopaedic surgeons, determine for those undisplaced or minimally displaced subcapital fractures, whether you're going to fix or do a hemiarthroplasty?
Well, I suppose it's all ratios of risk and all weighted probabilities. And I think the FAITH trial particularly showed us that if you're a smoker, if you're older, if you're more comorbid, you had a higher Powell's index, the chance of failing is greater. So a 65-year-old, maybe you can fix it, but an 88-year-old, I think, just replace it. It's about weight. There's no perfect solution. There's no absolutes. There's no nevers and always. But I think the older, more frail patient potentially has more to lose from a repeat operation or can't abide by any sort of restrictions if you feel they need to be imposed. In the worst case scenario, it needs to have a replacement, not fixation.
Christina.
May I ask Seth the question? I mean, on that question, because many times, at least in Spain, I suppose in Australia it's the same, New Zealand, it's the anesthesiologist who says, you know, putting in a screw is a lot less blood loss, it's a lot less injury, a lot less insult for the patient. Putting them in a hip arthroplasty, especially cemented, can be riskful, whatever. Could be a longer surgery, more bleeding, more risk for the patient. So what do you argue, what are your
No, I think it's been
answers to that anesthesiologist? I know you told it very well in your presentation, but just, you know, the key sentence that you would tell the anesthesiologist when you're there.
The day anaesthetist tells me what to do on behind the curtain. Well, of course, a two-way conversation. I don't tell them how to put a spinal in, despite observing a lot and standing behind them when they do it. Look, I think there's been a lot of evidence suggesting that the procedure itself does not affect outcomes. So there's data to back up just doing a longer operation. I think you just have to be in there until you're happy and you're happy done the best thing by the patient. And most anaesthetists are happy for you to keep going, as long as the patient's resuscitated and optimised beforehand. I haven't really had that as a problem. Yeah. I think a lot of the quick operation is surgeon-driven. You want to get to the tea room quicker or want to go home quicker, I must admit. You're not spending an extra hour that it may take to do a cemented hemiarthroplasty and stitch it up. Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, so we're randomising in the UK. I'm slightly biased, obviously, but it makes my life really easy just to say I have no idea what operation we should do, so let's randomise. So for patients over 60 with minimally displaced fractures that don't require reduction, we're randomising to arthroplasty or fixation for exactly the reasons that Seth elucidated. So we'll hopefully have some answers in the next few years in a randomised trial and a large-scale study. The one thing I would say is that we're talking here about fragility fractures. For younger patients, it's a relatively rare injury, but very different scenario. There's Chris, Seth, myself spend days at conferences discussing how to fix young people's hip fractures. It's hugely contentious. I'd strongly suggest you don't go to those meetings.
That's it. We certainly look forward to those results because in my mind that remains a real question that I don't know the answer to, which is, so it'll be great to have the data. On that, the point of avoiding reoperation has come up a couple of times, and I think, it's not information that we collect that well. Obviously, within our hip fracture registry, reoperation within 120 days is something that's questioned. But I think the importance of ensuring that we're doing the operation well the first time is key. Do you in the UK, Matt, and then I'll ask for you as well, Seth, do you arrange for, do you accept transfer from smaller centres for the more complex fractures, some of those 3-part or subtroche? Should we in Australia be saying, actually, it's totally fine for you in a smaller or regional centre to send that to a specialist centre, and we want to know right now, before we do the operation, similar to what we do in tumour?
So that's a great question, Catherine. The simple answer is no, we don't do that. So we have a very now well-defined system of hubs and spokes for big centres for major trauma. So that facility is available, but the route we've taken in the UK is to really concentrate hip fracture care in a smaller number of larger centres, but not necessarily co-located with major trauma centres. So, and all of those units are now treating a volume of patients where they should be comfortable with pretty much all the fracture patterns. Whether that's true or not is the different matter, but that's the route we've taken. But I think if you're working in a system where you're doing a very small number of cases each year, then having a friend down the road who's happy to take those cases is a great relief. And it's one of those few times when surgeons don't feel worried about transferring a patient because they're difficult fractures with complicated patients, and actually someone else doing them is often a relief to that surgeon rather than a threat to their practice. But different healthcare systems, different scenarios.
Thank you. Simone, we've got a couple of specific questions regarding your program. First of all, is there evidence for nutritional supplements use over a higher protein diet? And do we need to fight for supplements at all of our hospitals?
I think the general suggestion is that we should be supplementing everybody because we're then getting high protein in. But, you know, I mean, the reality is that many of our older patients don't eat much. They don't feel hungry. They're anorexic. It's about getting what we can in, and at least with supplements, we're getting a large quantity of protein in pretty easily.
And another direct question for you relating to albumin. If low albumin can also be due to an acute fracture, how do you interpret the data from PNI?
Yeah, I think that's why we're using the admission blood rather than anything else. You can't look at the day one blood, it's the actual admission albumin that you need to work on, because you are looking at a premorbid state, and what we note is that most people have a normal albumin at the time of admission. By the time you get to day one, and certainly 3 days post-op, it's plummeted.
Thank you. Neve, to you, thank you for your presentation. Certainly there's been a lot of work in cementation versus uncemented in hemiarthroplasty, and we all know the White study and are looking forward to more presentation around that in the next few days. The White study certainly showed that there was more increased benefit for cemented with respect to quality of life and decreased reoperation rate because of periprosthetic fracture compared to the use of uncemented prostheses. So do you have any comment about how that can then assist inform people's choices? So I guess we've got now mortality is about the same, and potentially increased reoperation rate with the uncemented prostheses. So do you think with all those things together, we're on the right track then with, you know, in Australia, over 90% of the arthroplasty and hip fracture patients are cemented?
Yeah, definitely. I think what we're finding is that cementing is a safe means of securing the arthroplasty and does have those post-operative benefits. We didn't specifically look at the post-operative benefits in our study, but we do recognise that this is well established. So definitely the research is supporting the use of cement.
Thank you. And we've actually gone over time, so we're going to have one final question. And Stephen, it's to you. Stephen, if there was one thing that you could change related to the care of your father in his last few weeks, what would it have been?
Well, that's yes, a very pertinent question. I think that it's really harking back to what I said, that looking at the whole scenario from his point of view. So here's a person who had quite an active life. Even though he'd gone into respite, he was remaining active there and enjoying himself. And suddenly his life has drastically changed because of one small accident, just a trip on the floor. Because of his damn orthotic footwear, he tripped in the dark, and that's what caused him to fall. But from then on, he just became sort of a cog in the wheel, and very little consideration given to his perspective on life. Now, what he was hoping for from going on from that point in time. And he obviously was thinking, well, his life's going to go on. He'll get his hip fixed up and he'll just go on with his life. But that just didn't seem to be considered at all. So there wasn't the perspective given by the clinicians looking at it from his point of view and how he was handling the situation and how he was feeling about what his hopes and aspirations and prospects were for the future. So I just think that's really to be able to put themselves, the clinicians, in the patient's perspective, to really try and then provide the care that would enable him to get the best outcome, not just clinically, but lifestyle as well. So I just feel that that was not adequately addressed at all.
That's a great point and a great way to end the session. Can you please join me in thanking all our speakers from this morning?